Apparently, Paul Whitewick did watch the original version of this video, explaining a load of major mistakes in his video about the Vinland map, because his reaction was to demand that it be deleted for copyright infringement. In this replacement version, I'm just going to summarise the true Vinland map story as indicated by the available evidence, in chronological order. In the year 1247, the diplomats sent to Tartaria and Mongolia by the Pope in 1245 to negotiate with the northern heirs of Genghis Khan reached Eastern Europe on their journey home, and a Franciscan friar we know only as C. de Bridia made detailed notes on the information they shared under the title Historia Tartarorum. An official report of the mission was also published under the title Historia Mongolorum and was used in compiling a section on the Mongols in a massive 4-volume historical encyclopedia by Vincent of Beauvais called the Speculum Historiale. A century later, an owner of the almost forgotten De Bridia notes had the smart idea of having a copy made and bound in with a set of the Speculum Historiale, which ended up in Switzerland. Fast forward several more decades to the 1430s, when a major church conference was held at the Swiss city of Basel, and a delegate requested an easy-reading copy of the enhanced Speculum set. With large writing, the 4 original parts each had to be split in 2, and the Historia Tartarorum ended up at the end of the second part of the original third part. The new copy was made very quickly and just had little notes to indicate where decorative elements like titles and illuminated letters should be added later, which the new owner never quite got round to. That copy ended up in the library of the Archdiocese of Zaragoza in Spain, and when they replaced that with a standard printed edition, they saved the part with the Historia Tartarorum in. Although never studied in detail, the text was briefly displayed in 1893 at an exhibition in Madrid on the theme of exploration to celebrate the quadricentenary of Columbus' return from the West Indies. In the 1950s, major European nations were shattered by World War II, while the United States was thriving. American institutional and private collectors bought European antiquities at knockdown prices, with few questions asked. To capitalise on this, Italian book dealer and fascist Enzo Ferrioli, who had prudently moved to Spain, made an interesting arrangement with some corrupt staff in the Zaragoza library. They would sell him interesting items, then destroy the library catalogue entries. He would have fake evidence made so it looked as if the books had belonged to private collectors, then sell them to foreign buyers. One of the many items he acquired in this way was the odd Speculum Historiale volume. He found that the Historia Tartarorum was never mentioned in academic books about the Mongols, and crucially, he did not find that it had once been exhibited in Madrid. Concluding that it was likely to be a unique, unknown and historically important medieval document, he decided that it would fetch a premium price from an American university. To kill 2 birds with 1 stone, he devised a brilliant plan. The Speculum volume was taken apart, and on the removed end papers he had a crude map drawn showing the world as known to the Church before Columbus, from the Gulf of Tartary in the east to Vinland, which we now call America, in the west. The medieval note indicating that the Speculum volume was the second part of the third part was altered to indicate that the map was an illustration for the first and second and third parts of the Speculum. It also seems likely that he had extra bookworm holes added through the new map into the Speculum Historiale text before the next step, which was binding the map and the Historia Tartarorum together in a new cover, then rebinding the Speculum Historiale text with its Zaragoza ownership marks carefully eliminated. Early in 1957, Ferrioli took the 2 volumes to London, where a book dealer with a mischievous sense of humour, Irving Davis, accompanied him to the British Museum, carrying only the newly bound Historia Tartarorum. Davis introduced him to 2 of the museum's librarians who would find it fascinating: printed book specialist George Painter and printed map specialist Raleigh Ashlyn Skelton, known as Peter to his friends. Sure enough, they were hooked, but they had no authority to do anything about it, and the manuscript specialists decided the map was a fake, so they refused to consider buying the volume even though the Historia Tartarorum did look genuine. Ferrioli took the rejected book back to mainland Europe, and at the office of Swiss book dealer Nicholas Rausch he had the opportunity to show it to a young American. Lawrence Witten, who had served in Europe as a teenager during the Second World War, abandoned a career in music to become a book dealer as soon as he graduated from Yale, because he understood that there was a fortune to be made buying from poverty-stricken Europeans and selling to wealthy Americans. It seems likely that Ferrioli told him about the British Museum rejection, but insisted that the Historia Tartarorum seemed genuine and important. Witten offered $3,500, including an introduction fee to Rausch, and apparently also promised a percentage of his sale profit. Ferrioli put Witten in touch with Irving Davis, and a cheerful chat in a cafe in Milan established that Yale librarian Thomas Marston, a friend of Witten's, was one of Davis's customers. Returning to America that autumn, Witten showed the Historia Tartarorum to Marston and to Yale's map librarian Alexander Vitor. Neither of them was a manuscript specialist, but both were concerned that the wormholes through the map did not match the single wormhole through the Historia, so Vitor could not recommend it for purchase. For reasons which may or may not be secretly related to tax, Witten made no further attempt to sell the volume, but gave it to his wife Cora as a present. At the beginning of spring 1958, Marston received an advance copy of the latest catalogue from Irving Davis, including the chunky 480-page Speculum Historiale volume at a knockdown bargain price of £75, which would be about $225 plus freight. He couldn't resist, and an American Vincent of Beauvais expert was mildly upset to receive his copy of the catalogue just too late, as did Lawrence Witten himself. Knowing that Witten was always interested in medieval book covers, Marston invited him to come and see it when it arrived. Recognising features it had in common with the Historia Tartarorum, Witten arranged to make a close comparison between the two volumes, and of course found that the wormholes showed the map had formerly been at the front of the speculum text, while the Historia Tartarorum was at the back. Suddenly it was obvious that the Historia Tartarorum was genuine, but Ferrioli's plan gave Witten a further option if he was bold enough to try. With tax rates in the 1950s as high as 91% for the highest incomes, rich Americans took full advantage of deductions allowable for charitable donations, particularly the law which stated that the deduction for donating property rather than money was based on the value of the property at the time of donation, not the time of acquisition. The authenticity of the map was still highly dubious, so its potentially colossal value as the earliest map to depict America could not be confirmed until it had been assessed by experts with sufficient status to convince the Internal Revenue Service. This would be challenging, as Ferrioli had had the map made in such a way that it could be passed off as a joke if things went seriously wrong. On the other hand, the potential tax deduction value of the map was so huge that, because of the rules about the maximum percentage of income that could be considered for deductions, only people earning millions of dollars a year could take advantage of it. In 1958, people that rich could simply stop an IRS investigation in its tracks. Witten conducted further studies of the map and spoke again with Ferrioli on his 1958 trip to Europe, before he and Cora offered to sell Yale University both the map volume and the speculum volume, which Marston had given her after the wormhole discovery. The price was about $300,000, a lifetime's earnings for a 1950s American worker, but a fraction of the potential value if the map was authenticated. On being contacted by Yale, vastly wealthy former student Paul Mellon decided to have some fun and bought the items for eventual donation, on the understanding that he would have Lawrence's full cooperation. The chosen expert with sufficient status to authenticate the map was Peter Skelton, while Thomas Marston was hired for the less problematic task of assessing the Historia Tartarorum and explaining its obvious links to the Speculum Historiale. Marston turned out not to be sufficiently skilled in translating medieval Latin, so George Painter was brought in to help. Overseeing the whole project was Alexander Vitor. Mellon, or his advisers, were as creative as Ferrioli in their approach to the challenge. First, during the authentication process, nobody else was allowed to examine the items, not even at Yale or the British Museum. Second, the official purpose of the work was to write a scholarly book about the items for publication by Yale University Press, not authentication for tax purposes. Third, it didn't matter if they took a fairly long time, because that would make their work more convincing. And of course, Lawrence Whitten managed to insert himself into the process, lying about the provenance of the items and making helpful suggestions to Skelton. So years passed. There was a moment of panic when somebody noticed that many old books listed by a historian in the 1930s for his own interest were now absent from the Zaragoza Library's catalogue. This led to the arrest and conviction of Ferraioli and the corrupt library staff, despite Whitten's attempts to help. The Speculum volume was too early for the historian's list, but several books Marston had innocently bought were among the stolen items, so he was quickly persuaded to sell the bulk of his collection to Yale, who were as immune from investigation as Mellon. Finally, in 1964, the book was ready for publication, just in the nick of time as the top tax rate was being reduced, rendering the donation value less attractive. Proof pages, including a specific claim of authenticity from Vita, were supplied to a valuer, who seems then to have supplied for the IRS a figure of around $700,000. Then, in a further cunning twist, Mellon's name was removed from the finalised version for public consumption, as an obstacle for nosy journalists. The very best, however, was still to come. Earlier in 1964, President Johnson had been persuaded by a sudden flurry of Congress motions to reintroduce Leif Erikson Day, commemorating the discovery of Vinland, which had been celebrated in 1935 on 9th of October, but ignored since because it was just before Columbus Day, 12th October. Needless to say, the launch of the Vinland map book and the revelation of the precious document was slated for 9th October the following year, but that was not a weekday, so it was postponed to 11th October, one day before Columbus Day 1965. Headlines all over the world on 12th October focused on the challenge to Columbus. Initial criticisms of the book and suspicions about the map itself were dismissed as pro-Columbus sour grapes, but over the following months, more and more academic studies expressed concerns, so the Smithsonian Institution in Washington held a Vinland Map Conference in November 1966. Lawrence Whitten attended and told more lies. Skelton confessed to doubts, but Painter was not the sort of man who would change his mind when confronted with new evidence. The most serious aspect of the conference was the realisation that the map had been deliberately hidden from the most qualified experts before 1965, so when it was sent to be displayed at the British Museum early in 1967, Yale agreed that it could be examined by both manuscript experts and scientists. The latter quickly found that it was nothing like any other document they had ever seen. The lines seemed to have been made in two layers, one like graphite pencil, which was not used in the 1430s, the other some sort of brown gum. The parchment had been treated with a mystery chemical, but they were not allowed to take a large enough sample to analyse it. And here's where we encounter the biggest hole in the Vinland map story. For some reason, Yale did not publish the British Museum findings or permit the museum to reveal them. Nor did the Smithsonian publish the conference proceedings until 1971, over 6 years after Mellon donated the map to Yale. Belatedly following up a British Museum recommendation, Yale allowed McCrone Laboratories of Chicago to take minute samples from locations all over the map for analysis, and their results were published in 1974. Most significantly, the mysterious gum in the ink contained particles of 20th century anatase titanium dioxide pigment, implying that it was a modern fake. Lawrence Whitten at last admitted that he had not been entirely honest, but Paul Mellon chose not to take legal action against him, and Mellon had done nothing himself which the IRS could use against him, besides which the statute of limitations for a criminal fraud case had expired. The McCrone analyses, though basically correct, had been slightly sloppy, and in 1985 Smithsonian scientist Jacqueline Olin, who had been given a watching brief after the 1966 conference, arranged for a new analytical method to be applied at the University of California, Davis. This analysis, claiming that McCrone had vastly overstated the quantity of anatase, formed the basis of decades of controversy until its mistakes, not easily detectable in the published report, began to be exposed in 2008. The final proof of the Speculum Historiale volume's former ownership and the map's reliance on an 18th century document did not begin until a Google search for Cedar Bridia in 2011 revealed recently digitized old books referring to the 1893 Madrid exhibition which did not mention the map.